I'm Fatheree,
This is Dave.
and this is Tex-Trek.
Engage.
Welcome back aboard the Starship Texas for the 134th installment of the Tex-Trek podcast, the home of Star Trek fandom from deep in the heart of Texas, where we talk all about Star Trek all the time. And tonight we are joined by a very special guest. You might know him from Twitter as the Star Trek communist, but we have Mr. Will Nguyen here with us, and we're here to discuss with him Star Trek's criticisms of capitalism, a hot button but relevant subject. So, Will, how the hell are you?
I'm good. Thanks, Fatheree. Thanks, Dave, for having this conversation today. I'm doing pretty well, all things considered. I think everyone's trying to manage through everything, but having these little Zoom conversations when you're talking about something you enjoy as much as I do about Star Trek and Marxism, it makes the pandemic a little bit more manageable.
Yeah, for sure. Having the interconnections of the internet has been a godsend the last 12 months.
It was handy for an introvert person like me even before the pandemic. now, now it's a lifeline.
Absolutely.
But Will, whenever we have a new guest on the show, I do like to ask before we delve too deep into anything. Just tell us a little bit about your love of Star Trek and how you got into Star Trek. What was your introduction to it?
Sure. I think my entry point was very similar to many people of my generation, pun not intended, but that was syndication, watching a lot of TNG on an afternoon like this, on a random Saturday afternoon, watching a few episodes back to back. That's when I really became a Star Trek fan. Is watching all of those seasons in the early '90s, and then only after finishing TNG that I then explore all of the other entry points into the franchise. So I remember watching Deep Space Nine, and I was going to be 8 or 9. And at that time, it was kind of dark. It was kind of grim. It wasn't the same TNG. I remember not liking it as much, but still being drawn to it because it was still Star Trek. And then, of course, over time, discovering TOS and the TOS movies, which I love. Then discovering, the animated series, and then, of course, Enterprise and all the various iterations too. But I think over time, the fact that the franchise is so big, like 800 plus episodes and movies, has allowed it to just continue to be like my number one fandom. Hasn't really been extinguished, but it's like a fine wine. I think you appreciate it more as you go on, because there's so much of it to kind of dig into.
Is TNG still your top guy in the franchise?
Oh, it's tough. It depends on the day. When you ask me, during
Mhm.
the week or depending upon the day. I think TNG is a sentimental favorite. If I had to choose one, it would have to be, I think, Deep Space Nine. Obviously, I'm wearing a Lower Decks uniform, so I'm a big fan of Lower Decks. We'll talk about the new iterations of Treks. It all really depends. I think there's some that I prefer more, but I think I find something to enjoy in all the Treks. So I think I would have to choose one of Deep Space Nine.
What about any specific episodes that really stand out to you? Do you have like any favorite episodes that you like to go back to the most?
Sure. Well, I think one, if I'm using it from a Marxist perspective, it would have to be bar association, where Rom unionizes his bar and quotes the Communist Manifesto. That's a good one to go back to. But just in terms of a general episode, it depends. I mean, I think I love Chain of Command in TNG. I love Way of the Warrior in Deep Space Nine. I love Scorpion in Voyager. I love those 3-part mini movie arcs. You have Enterprise season 4, which is a wonderful season of Star Trek. And it just depends on your flavor that you're going back to. But I think over time, I kind of go back to those 2-parter episodes. I think Star Trek's always done a really great job with those episodes.
What about any favorite characters that really stand out to you?
Oof, another good question. So I think because I said Deep Space Nine, I think I'll start there. I think I love the fact that to date, it's still the most unique Star Trek because it's not set on a starship. It's on a space station. I would say half of the main cast and almost all of the secondary cast are non-Starfleet. So I love Odo, I love Kira, I love Quark, I love Gowron and Martok and Nog, although he eventually joined Starfleet. All those characters are outside of the Federation but have really interesting things to say, which I really do enjoy. And I think, I always love the character that's the kind of the Spock or Data stand-in. So of course you have Spock, you have Data, and then you have, an Odo, and then you have, T'Pol later on, you have a Tuvok, all those really interesting characters that play those broad kind of archetypes. Each series does a really good spin on that dynamic. So I think those are the ones I typically gravitate towards.
How do you feel about Saru?
Oh, Saru, of course. I can't believe I left out Saru being another great example.
Feel like he's kind of in that ballpark at least.
Oh, absolutely. I think I love Saru. I think season 1 of Discovery was, I think, a transition for many people to kind of adjust to that new flavor of Trek being back on TV. But Saru, from right out of the gates, I loved him. And he only has developed into a much better character. And that has to do with, I think, the writing has done, I think, a lot crisper and sharper. And Doug Jones is magnificent, both in and out of costume and in and out of makeup, as we've seen this last season. He does a fantastic job. So actually, Saru might be my favorite Disco character right now.
Not to sidetrack too much, but do you think he got shafted losing command?
Oh, well, I think we'll have to see what happens in season 4. I think I actually like it because sometimes the critique of the older Star Treks, especially with Next Gen, is that everything just kind of stayed the same forever, right? But there's a good argument to be made, like, what happens to Picard after Best of Both Worlds? Does he go back automatically to become Picard again? Does Riker become Captain permanently? I think the newer Treks have the ability to kind of shake things up a little bit more, as evidenced by them jumping forward 900 years. So we'll see. I think Saru will still be a great character, even if he isn't a captain, although I'll say this, I have a sneaking suspicion this is not the last time we've seen him in the captain's chair, but it'll probably be a different ship, which is totally fine in my book. So
there's a lot of work to be done in the 32nd century.
There is, and that was a great season, Disco. This last one.
Right on.
Well, just to bring things back around to like our main topic, one thing that Star Trek has, I guess, done since Star Trek 4 in 1986, when first time they acknowledged that money doesn't exist in the future of Star Trek, and I like to refer to it as a post-capitalist society, and the idea of like capitalism is something that we don't always talk about in the public, but it's not the default status quo that a lot of people think it is, and it's just like always been around and will always be around. It's something that we essentially need to evolve past and move past, and we're seeing so much of the ramifications of it like right now, and the destructive path that we're kind of on now, that we need to change course. And Star Trek is a very good vision of a better future. I want to like ask you just a little bit about like some of your beliefs as far as Marxism, like traditional like criticism of capitalism goes, and where you see that intersecting with Star Trek.
Right. That's a great question. I think it's one that is asked to me all the time. And I think just goes back to the very premise of Star Trek, right? So the premise of Star Trek, which is why I enjoy Star Trek more than say Star Wars, although I love Star Wars. But I love Star Trek more because it's about us, right? It's a story about humanity in the future. And the premise is that humanity has figured it out. They've eliminated poverty, war, hunger, greed, you know, all of those things that we kind of suffer still in terms of social ills. And humanity has figured out a way to work not only amongst itself, but with others, right? And that has kind of been the through point, the thread that ties all of the series together, more or less, is that it's humanity in the future, and it's a better world, and it's a better future to aspire to. And for me, I think that basically sets up the question of Marxism and the question of class struggle so effectively, because that's actually the situation that we find ourselves in right now. We have the ability in our society to eliminate hunger, greed, poverty, all those things, right? It's within our technological capabilities to do so. It's not that hard. We can do it to make sure that everyone is housed, fed, has proper medical care, you know, doesn't die of exposure or thirst or starvation. That's not that hard to do. The question is a question of distribution and of those resources, which is in turn a question of who controls those resources in society, the means of production, as Marx alluded to. And that is what kind of brings it together. We want that better world in society. We want it for ourselves right now, not just for our children or our subsequent generations. How do we get there, right? How do we get there from there to here, if you will, to borrow a line from Enterprise? And I think there's a common argument that you hear. Well, we can only get to the Star Trek world because of a magical box called a replicator that just replicates things at a command or a wish, and that's the only way you can eliminate all these terrible things. And I would say that's a very common argument that I hear, but I think it's also a dodge. It's also a very insincere or disingenuous argument because we already live in a post-scarcity society. We destroy more food on a daily basis than is actually needed. We can actually feed 10 billion people on the productive capacity of the earth, but we actually waste and destroy those things because it's far more profitable to not do those things. In the early days of the pandemic, you had farmers just destroying their eggs, pouring the milks down drains, right? Pouring bleach on food, right? Because it's not profitable just to give away food. So that's why you have this perverse contradiction of you actually have the tremendous technological productive capability honed after centuries of technique, the working class of the world. They can provide for people, but they can't because they actually don't own the means of production, right? They have to sell their labor. You have to go to work, right? You have to earn a paycheck to live, right? You know, you have to earn a living, right? Those are all things that are baked into our society that we assume that's a given. But why can't we just exist to exist, right? Why do we have to make sure that, oh, we don't, do this thing. You don't get a paycheck. That, you have the freedom to starve. You have the freedom to be homeless, right? And that's not a freedom at all, right? That's basically extortion. It's basically blackmail, right? And it shows you that's the incredible banality of society, right? Where we just assume that's just the way it is, right? And we have to do those things. And the question is always about class struggle, right? Who controls society? Who produces all the value and wealth in society? It's actually labor. You need, the boss needs you more than you need the boss, right? But the boss calls all the shots. Why is that, right? If you don't go to work, your boss doesn't get the company that you work for, the boss that you work for, right? He actually needs the workers to go in, right? But all of the incentives in society exploits the surplus value that the workers create. But they have tremendous power, the working class, right? But they actually don't realize they're part of a class, right? That's why so much of our society is built towards just thinking you as an individual contributor at work, right? Your boss is your friend. We're a family at work, right? But until it's time to fire you, right? Then it's, not much of a family anymore, right? But that's the idea, is that the ruling class, the capitalist class, are well aware of their interests. The workers are not aware of their interests, right? And that's not by accident, it's by design. Racism, nationalism, sexism, those are used to divide the working class. Those workers don't look like you, they don't speak your language, they have different culture, they deserve less, right? That's how wars start, right? the idea of Marxism is to say that all workers have the same interests. We're all being exploited, regardless of borders. These borders are artificial. And that only by uniting together can we actually solve all of these very solvable problems. So then going back to Star Trek, right? The universe as predicated by Star Trek, right? Let's just take Earth, for example. By the 22nd, 23rd, certainly by the 24th centuries, right? It's a one world government. There are no borders that we know of, right? They often allude to paradise on Earth. They've eliminated poverty and war, all those types of things, right? That's a pretty significant achievement in human history. They've achieved a one world government with no national borders. There's no references to collecting rent. There's no reference to collecting health insurance premiums. There's no any of these things, right? So how do you get to that point, right? So for me, as a Marxist Star Trek fan, I inject my political views to say the only way to get to that is to eliminate an ownership class of the capitalists, right? Private property, private ownership. I have this contract. I own you, right? I own this property, right? No. The only way to get to that society is the working class controls the means of production, can provide for itself on a planned economic basis to meet people's needs as opposed to the profit building. And you extend that to on an interstellar scale. There might be instances where it's not as clear cut as it is on Earth, where they kind of eliminate all those types of things. Where I would say it's probably, I think Earth is a good example of a communism that's been achieved on a planetary scale, but on a federation scale, on an interstellar scale, it's probably socialism, right? There still is a state apparatus, but it's a worker state. It's a worker state that provides for people's needs, as opposed to the production just to produce things to sell for profit. So I think that's what's so cool about Star Trek, is that it's very setting, it's very premise. It begs the question, how do you get there? And it's not a question about, I think Star Trek often has this instance where they just say, well, we just got to walk in each other's shoes. We just got to be, got to sit down on a conference table. We got to talk things out and we'll figure things out. And as much as I love those conference room scenes with Picard and all those types of things, the question is always a question of power. It's not about convincing your oppressors to just give up their power or to be more benevolent, right? It's always a question of class struggle. That power will not be given up willingly. So I think that's where Star Trek doesn't explain it. They never just say, this is how you get there. They just say the Vulcans come, they suddenly realize we're not alone in the universe, and then somehow that just makes everyone work together. And I think that's the opening that allows someone like me to explain, like, okay, realistically, how do we want to get to the point where we can actually meet people's needs and we don't have to live literally paycheck to paycheck? That's a society that's actually very well within our grasp if we understand the forces that are at play.
Yeah, it seems like Star Trek doesn't, well, obviously when it began in the 60s for sure, and even now, isn't looking to have the kind of nitty-gritty economic discussion. And I think that leaves an interesting place for someone like you to come in and speak about it. There's, I see the argument play out on message boards all the time, though, that there's, as to whether Star Trek is truly communist in its depiction, but since it doesn't say those words, it doesn't talk about markets, or whether we're someone is imposing that viewpoint on it. What do you think about like Star Trek's? I'm not going to say inability to like sort of express the ideas more concretely, but why do you think it holds off on getting into the nitty gritty?
Right. Well, I think at the end of the day, it's still a show that's being produced by Paramount, by CBS, right? It's a show that's actually still controlled by a corporate entity that has to make a profit, right? So it's contradictory, right? But that's okay, right? Marxism understands the world as it exists materially, and as it exists, there are many contradictions in society. It's actually those contradictions that allow people to then begin to question things and then begin to move into struggle. So Star Trek is a great example of it. And I think a lot of it also has to do with the environment and setting of Star Trek in terms of its production. It's primarily written by liberal writers in Hollywood. Liberal writers in Hollywood, at least the Hollywood executives, for the most part, they're capitalists, right? Harvey Weinstein, we know how terrible he is. All those studio executives, right? They talk about good game about social values, right? But at the end of the day, they're cold-hearted capitalists, right? So they're going to influence how a show is written, right? So sometimes Star Trek will only nibble at the edges because that's what they can kind of sneak through, right? They have to serve a lot of interests, right? And I think for me as a Marxist, I'm okay with that, in the sense that I'm okay with them leaving it vague, because if they were to explain it in a little bit more specific detail, I know that they would probably do a job that I wouldn't agree with, because they're probably going to inject it with a lot of liberal biases, right? Or just kind of utopian biases to say, oh, we can just hand wave away a lot of these deep antagonisms in society, just to say, hey, we just need to understand and talk to each other all about those types of things. And that's actually that's not actually how you progress in society. Every progress in society has been made through struggle. Every concession has been made through struggle. And that struggle is specifically class struggle between the workers, those that produce value and wealth in society, and those that expropriate that wealth. So I think for me, Star Trek can only go so far, because it's still a TV show. It's still a franchise that has to serve all these types of things. But also shows you that ostensibly, we could, down the road, we could write better Star Treks, because what if Star Trek didn't have the property of Star Trek, the franchise of Star Trek? What if it wasn't locked behind private property, right? That's what a copyright is, right? CBS owns Star Trek, right? And you can only approve certain things and write certain things with the approval of CBS and Paramount, right? But we know that there are fans that have tremendous ideas that have influenced Star Trek, right? The writers and producers sometimes use those ideas from the fans, right? The fans themselves saved Star Trek after it was canceled, right? All those conventions, all those zines, right? They produced a lot of their own materials through fan fiction, what have you. Imagine how much more thought-provoking, how much more, I think, better Star Trek could be produced if it wasn't locked behind the idea of copyright, the idea of private property, right? You can only get through that. You can only get to that position, that ability, if you eliminate capitalism, right? If you eliminate the profit motive, if you eliminate all those types of things, right? What if you actually just allow people to play with ideas, use all of the productive techniques of movie making and TV production, but it's not locked behind shareholders, it's not locked behind a company, right? So arguably, under socialism and ultimately communism, you would have a flourishing of art and culture, because it's not locked behind certain companies that own these properties, own the rights to these things forever, and they just produce things just to crank out profit. So I think that's how I kind of address that question, is that under capitalism, it can't move beyond its own biases at this point.
Well, Will, let me ask you about this last year, 2020. I keep talking about it because I'm still kind of overwhelmed that we had 3 Star Trek shows in a single year, which had never, ever, ever happened before in the history of this franchise. And I think all of those shows, to some degree, kind of address some of these issues, and they all 3, in their own ways, kind of shine a light on some of the problems with capitalism. So I just want to ask you, looking at Picard season 1, Lower Deck season 1, and Discovery season 3, what were some of the things in those shows that stood out to you on what we're talking about now?
Right. So there's a great way to look at popular culture, and the great way to look at popular culture is that it's a mirror, it's a reflection on the current mood in society, and what the writers and the producers and the actors, what do they view society in, right? We talk about you go to conventions and you often hear Star Trek is a mirror into society. They talk about issues through metaphor, right? Through all of these examples that tell an allegorical story or a lesson, using space as that mechanism to do so. And that is still very much applicable to the new Star Treks, right? But what is the mood of the current society right now, right? The mood of the current society right now is actually one of deep pessimism, deep cynicism, right? A lack of faith in the confidence of institutions to actually do anything to better one's lives, right? That's what's reflected in the media that we have right now. And that's actually because of the crisis of capitalism, right? The crisis in bourgeois institutions. No one, everyone agrees Congress sucks. Everyone agrees that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, right? So what do we do about it, right? That's reflected in the culture. That's reflected in the media that we consume, and Star Trek is not immune from that. So if you look from, say, TOS to now, TOS was in a different period, right? It was the ascendancy of Cold War liberalism, right? So it was the height of the confidence of the US superpower to say we can project our power. And that's when liberalism still had kind of a confident outlook in society, right? So that's why you had them going to the stars. So you could actually unite people, right? You had a Russian on the bridge, you had a Japanese person on the bridge, you had a black woman, on the bridge, right? They had an optimism because at that time, liberalism had an optimism. And that's because capitalism at that time was still in a much more vibrant stage. It was still could produce a lot of reforms for the workers around the world because of a different set of material circumstances. But as the crisis of capitalism has extended, right, you have that mood permeate through, I think, that media. So that's why you see in Star Trek, I think that the theme that you can have from the new Star Treks is one of, I would say, deconstruction, right? So that's what Discovery is, right? Discovery is about, how does Michael Burnham basically and this small crew that you've never heard of, right? How do they kind of restore the values of the Federation during the Klingon War, and later on to bring those values into the 32nd century where the Federation is a shell of itself, right? So a lot of deconstruction happening there. Picard is another great example of it. I actually like Picard a lot, but it is a huge tonal shift from what we know. And the idea of Picard is the Federation I would view it as Revolution Betrayed. It's a famous book written by a famous Marxist revolutionary, Leon Trotsky, which talked about the degeneration of the Soviet Union, the first worker state. And in the same way, the Federation is that in the Picard era. It's degenerated. It is not the Starfleet that you know. Picard is in exile, cast away, right? And he has to kind of rebuild those values. He's cynical himself, right? So how does he build those values up again? It's a much darker world. But I think there are good stories to tell in that perspective. It parallels, historical examples. And I think with Lower Decks, it's deconstruction in a different way, though, right? So they do it in a comedy way, which I think is so brilliant, because in comedy, they can kind of poke at the Star Trek trappings, right? So Starfleet and the Prime Directive and all those types of things, they kind of poke at it. But by poking at it, they begin to ask some interesting questions. But it's done in a funny way. It's done in a very zippy way. But they question, the fact that I love Lower Decks. I'm wearing the uniform right now. Right from the get-go, they're like, the senior staff are very incompetent. They take all the credit. We do all the work. They take all the credit, right? It's inherently class conscious, right? The idea of buffer time, they have to pad out their time because the upper layer is very inefficient. They only get their position through nepotism. That's a huge thing, right? In the last episode where Mariner is discovered to be Freeman's daughter, right? Nepotism is a reflection of material conditions. Why is there nepotism in a society of post-scarcity? Right? Why do they care? Right? It shows you there's a degeneration happening in the Federation, right? The fact that they've alluded to there are different replicator levels. The officers get better food than the lower deckers, right? Wild, right? Why is there why is there literally a class differentiation within Starfleet, right? So it poses all these really cool questions, very interesting questions, deconstructing the Federation in a comedic way too. But I think overall, that's the theme is, right, Star Trek has existed in canon for 54 years. Now people are trying to say, okay, what stories can we tell, right? What can we actually talk about and analyze? And I think people are really coming from a perspective of they have no faith in these institutions, nor should they. I think that's a good thing. People are having the illusions that the politicians are not on their side, the rich are not on their side. It's one big club and you're not in it, right? That anger in society is being reflected in popular culture, right? There's a deep distrust of everything, and it permeates Star Trek. But that doesn't mean that's a bad thing. You can actually write some good stories from that. But I think you actually have to be just mindful of kind of the setting in which all of these shows are emerging.
Do you think anything is lost in kind of portraying Starfleet and the Federation more critically, with a little bit of a cynical sense of humor through Lower Decks that wouldn't have been present? I mean, we've seen the problems in Starfleet in past eras, but you know, a little bit more of maybe systemic issues revealed in Lower Decks. Do you think do you miss? Is there a part of you that misses the, I guess, the utopianism that was projected before that?
Right. I think it's a balance. So I think that's why I actually enjoy Lower Decks. On balance, I think it's the one of the newer Treks I find myself rewatching more, and it's only a 10 half-an-hour episodes, if that, right? Mm-hmm. But I find myself going back to it because I think it has that balance of, I think what you're referring to, Dave, is it has that the TNG aesthetic, the way the door whooshes, the way they talk about things, right? The way that Boimler has that concert requiem for a hug, right? All those little aspects of Star Trek that you remember from the 90s, I think that's still very much a powerful pull for me and many other fans. So we want to see that again. But I think the deconstruction is good because I think fans want to see like the kind of dig behind or go behind the curtain a little bit to see kind of what is society, right? And I think there is a misunderstanding, I think, on a broader level about what utopianism is. And I think it comes from a perspective of, if you don't have an idea of Marxism or historical materialism, which is analyzing the world through observable laws, through observable technique, in the same way that we observe the natural world. You can apply those similar laws to the social world, right? It comes from a material basis. You can kind of see that things can be contradictory. There can be an interpenetration of opposites in certain things in society, but that doesn't mean that entire project is worth discarding, or that it's not something that can be worth striving towards, or actually something that actually, because of its contradictions, has in itself the engine to actually then progress forward, because it needs to resolve those contradictions, right? Which is kind of what class struggle is, resolve the contradictions in society. So I think sometimes with people that like Star Trek, they watch it for the utopianism. They say, I just want this better world to escape to, and I want it to be perfect because my world right now is not very great, not very perfect. So I want to escape to that. And I look to these Starfleet heroes as role models. And on some level, we all agree on some level with that. This is why we watch those shows. That's why we have such a deep connection to those characters. But that, I think, misinterprets kind of how things progress in society. You need those contradictions to progress forward. And that's a perfect example of how you look at, the Soviet Union, right? So how can you look at something that degenerated into a Stalinist authoritarian system and state, from the fact that it was the most, in my opinion, and the opinion of many Marxists, the most consequential event in human history. The working class took power from the capitalists and were able to maintain power, right? The October Revolution was a tremendous step forward. They eliminated landlordism, they eliminated capitalism. But then it became its opposite, right? So how do you defend all those types of things? I wear the hammer and sickle. How do I defend the hammer and sickle when it's supposedly associated with the terrible crimes of Stalinism, right? You have to understand that things are contradictory and things are in flux, things can change. But what are the ideas behind it, right? The ideas of the Federation are like the ideas of the hammer and sickle, for me, in my opinion. The hammer and sickle represent the union of the working classes together. The hammer is the industrial proletariat, right? The sickle represents the peasantry, the farmers, right? So it was a union of the urban and rural classes together, recognizing that they have shared interests. That symbol represents powerful ideas. It represents a unity of the working classes. It's an idea that predates the Soviet Union, actually. Same thing with the Federation, right? The Federation is an idea that, much you see in Discovery, it's an idea that doesn't die. That's why you have Aditya Sahil, right, saying, there may not be a federation that I can see, but I still hold on to those ideals, right? Is that there is a better society. The workers, the world can and should unite. We can move beyond our old prejudices, right? So the ideas of the Federation are still there. It's still worth fighting for. They're still a planned economy, right? You don't see them chart. You don't see Picard, having a W-2. There are no bi-weekly paychecks in Star Trek that we know of. They're not charging rent. There are no health insurance premiums, right? There are tremendous things that have been achieved in the Federation in terms of meeting people's needs. But at the same time, there's a bureaucracy. Starfleet, in many iterations, going back to Search for Spock and even the original series, where Starfleet, they're kind of terrible, right? There's a bureaucracy that's beholden to no one. There's Section 31 that exists that is up to nefarious deeds, right? There are some very questionable actions they take towards other civilizations, right? So how do you make sense of that while still understanding that's still a huge step forward in terms of people's development and society's development, right? And I think having an understanding of how contradictions work in society and in the real world can make you appreciate how the Federation can be many things simultaneously. And it's because it's many things simultaneously, it can progress because those contradictions can't coexist forever, right? And you see that in Lower Decks where, Mariner says, Starfleet's good at observing, bad at maintaining, right? There's dissension from Freeman saying, I disagree with almost all of Starfleet in terms of what they do, in terms of the prime direction, but I can't say anything. That's actually very revolutionary when you think about it. That's actually how revolutions and uprisings and rebellions happen in the real world. You have defections from the army, defections from the armed bodies of men from a previous regime that start to sway, that start to go into the opposite direction, saying, we need to, break decisively from the previous government, the previous society. So that's how I think you can kind of extract the good parts that is worth defending, while examining the fact that it's still very imperfect because it's very contradictory in how it's portrayed.
So you would say that they are still portraying sort of an aspirational kind of interaction in that sense. It is portraying the progress. In revealing maybe some of the warts of Starfleet in Lower Decks, that they are in fact sort of revealing also ways to move forward, to resolve these things, and to maybe be more honest about what's behind progress.
Yeah, and still have a degree of the traditional like Star Trek aspiration. It's just being presented in the characters and not in the fictional institutions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way to phrase it. I think that's a perfect way to phrase, I think, what Lower Decks is trying to get towards. But of course, Mike McMahon is not a Marxist. Star Trek itself, even Lower Decks itself although it poses those really interesting questions, still, ultimately will probably go towards an answer that doesn't address these things head on, which is fine. We can just use that story to kind of use to explain, real life situations. But I think that is a perfect way to encapsulate exactly how you can make sense of these seemingly at odds things while recognizing there's a way forward by reconciling as best you can those opposites.
And Mike McMahon, I saw, is following you on Twitter now, so you can.
He's not following me on Twitter. He just liked one of my tweets.
Okay.
But
he needs to be.
One day, maybe he'll follow me.
Yeah, we got to get you there. Well, let me ask you this. Something that I think, we've all seen polls and stuff showing more and more young people are starting to become critical of capitalism. There are polls now where I think I saw 40%. It might have actually gone up above 50% at this point. But like people under 30, like say that they dislike capitalism, and I can certainly see why. Stagnant wages and other societal factors going on right now. But I can even see, with Star Trek being this corporate thing that is made by capitalists, I can even see, just with the current zeitgeist, more and more poking at capitalism in Trek. I recently saw a video interview that Jesse Gender did with the actor Ian Alexander, who plays Gray on Star Trek, and they're both Jesse and Ian Alexander. They're both pretty young people, under 30, and they're actually joking around about like, oh yeah, like capitalism's so terrible, and it kind of makes me happy to see that in younger people. And I want to see more of that brought to the forefront in our pop culture. And we see things in Picard when they go to the Free Cloud planet, and it's basically like planet capitalism and how terrible everything seems to be there. Or in Discovery, where Admiral Vance and Osira have that conversation, and they actually name drop capitalism as being the bad guy and like something that shouldn't be operating within Federation space and stuff like that. So do you see that trend going forward? Do you think it's a good opportunity to talk to more people that are more open-minded to some of the stuff now?
Yeah, I think it's a reflection of the times, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I think that's how people form connections with the media that they watch and they consume and participate in and they share, right? That's the energy that they bring to kind of their fandom. And fandom comes from also experiences of their lives too. And there's there's no greater teacher than your own experiences, right? So to use the example that you brought, Fatheree, about Ian Alexander and Jesse Gender being of a younger generation, being more openly critical, hostile to capitalism, right? I think that makes perfect sense, right? There's a generation. I'm an older millennial. There's some that are Zoomers as well, and certainly capitalism affects all generations too, right? There are poor boomers. There are senior citizens that can't that still have to work at Walmart or at Walgreens because they can't survive on their social security checks, so they still have to work at 80 years of age. So exploitation happens across all generations, to be sure, but particularly of the younger generation. They're far more radicalized because they see by their own lived experiences through their own eyes the complete failures of capitalism, right? They've elected Obama twice, and what happened under Obama's term, right? A black president, huge progress, right? What happened during his term? Occupy Wall Street and Ferguson, the first Black Lives Matter, right? All those things happened under a progressive president, quote unquote, right? You had a massive recession of which we are still not recovered from. You have a depression that's coming due to COVID, right? You have, they've known nothing but war, right? The war in Afghanistan is as old as a millennial, right? They're still in that war, right? Why are we still fighting, right? There are drone strikes that are happening still. People still being deported, right? These are happening under Democratic administrations, right? What happened over this past summer with George Floyd in Minneapolis, right? That was a Democratic city with a Democratic mayor, Democratic council. Los Angeles, Chicago, New York are Democratic cities, Democratic strongholds, Democratic mayors. There's the highest incidence of police murder, right? So what do, right? People can see, they can see through the lies, right? They went through school. They just say, hey, you go to school and take on all this debt, then you'll get a job, then you'll get, you'll have to have that good American dream lifestyle that's been portrayed, right? But then that's completely shattered when they meet reality. People are working multiple gig jobs, people with master's degrees, working multiple gig jobs, right? In order to survive, Uber, Lyft, Instacart on the side just to survive, right? Having all this debt, right? And they supposedly did things the right way. And that's just because of the crisis of capitalism. It no longer has the ability to provide for people. It no longer has a material basis to provide any reforms. That's why even this fight for 15, right, that Bernie Sanders was such a big advocate for, it's going to be phased in over 5 years from now, maybe. So by 2025, you might have $15 an hour, where in reality, the real living wage should be $28, $30 an hour. The fight for 15 took over 20 years when all said and done. And by the time it actually gets enacted, it'll be meaningless. It'll be as the equivalent of $8 an hour. That shows you capitalism has nothing to give you. And what they'll give you ultimately will be meaningless because it has no ability to give those reforms anymore if it still wants to maintain profits, right? It's still maintain, so they take it on the workers, right? So this is the setting of which people watch media. This is the people that they see. Like this is the cynicism I was referring to, right? But that's not necessarily a bad thing because people want a way forward. They want a way out. And that's why they gravitate towards Star Trek. They look at the next generation, that wonderful bridge of the Enterprise D, which is those nice pastel colors. It's carpeted. Everything looks great, right? They're like, why can't we have that society, right? We have smartphones, right? We have smartphones, a computer literally in our pockets that have more computing power than a tricorder. And yet we still can't, there's still homeless people. There's still people that can't, put food on the table for their children, but we have an amazing smartphone, a computer that was beyond the wildest dreams of Spock, right? That's that contradiction that I was referring to in terms of capitalism, right? And I think that's where people are saying, so media will then be reflective of that. And I think this is not the first time you've had this in society. The last period where there was as a similar instability and a similar anger on a class level was in the 60s and 70s during the Vietnam War, during the Civil Rights Movement. The entire period there around the world was a tumultuous period. That was a period of radicalism, of the Black Panthers, of Malcolm X, all those types of things. brave revolutionaries at that time. That was reflected in the media at that time as well. But then things also can change as well. Things can stabilize, and the media could then kind of change, like it did in the 80s and 90s, right? With the fall of the Soviet Union, the Cold War ending, you had the quote unquote end of history by Francis Fukuyama, right? That's the same time period of Star Trek 6, right? Where everything was looking great, right? Everything was optimistic. We've solved the crisis. We've reached the end of history. There's no longer any struggle. Everything's great. And then what happened a few years there? The dot-com bubble burst. 9/11 happened, right? The Iraq War happened, recession after recession, right? So it shows you the mood changes, the media changes, right? And it's looking for an answer, for a way out, right? And I think now we're at a particular point where the crisis of capitalism is so dire, it's being reflected even the most optimistic of our medias, which is Star Trek, right? And I think they'll get to a positive direction. But of course, it'll be done in a way that's safe for capitalism. They're not going to really challenge it strongly, but they'll question it, because I think it's on a lot of people's minds at this point. And I think it's incumbent upon people like myself to then use it to explain to people about this is why this is happening and this is the way forward.
Very cool. Well, let me also ask you, because I know some people are going to be watching this and they're going to be really upset, and they're going to be like, oh no, like you don't know what you're talking about. Like there has to be some type of form of capitalism. There has to be, you're paying for a Star Trek show that you watch. You are buying merchandise. You're buying a uniform and wearing it. And I've heard you talk about this stuff before. So before we close off, I just want to give you an opportunity to address those criticisms right now.
Sure. I think it just shows you that there's just a misunderstanding of kind of how things work and of history, and that's also not by accident, right? People are taught what they are taught through schools and the education system, and the schools and education system, as Marxists, we view it as a tool of the ruling class to instill their ideas. When they say that when someone says I don't have an ideology, I'm beyond that. I'm more facts driven. I'm data driven. I believe in science. I don't have an ideology. What works? What they're really saying is that they have the ideology of the ruling class when they say they don't have an ideology, because that's what's being pumped in, right? From the schools, our media, TV, the media that we consume. That's where it's coming from. It's the ideas of the ruling class. And what are the ideas of the ruling class? The ideas of the ruling class is things are inherently good. There might be some things that need to be tweaked, but things are inherently good. This is the natural way of things. This is how society should run naturally. We just need to tweak things on the side. And they have to come up with all these misconceptions to explain away, or at least get people to not question why there's tremendous inequality in society, why there's tremendous contradictions in society, right? Why do we have smartphones, tremendous capabilities there, and we can't seemingly feed people? People are dying in the streets, right? How do you reconcile those two things? And you have to misdirect people, right? So they say, okay, commerce therefore equals capitalism, right? So if you somehow participate in a commercial transaction or commerce, or in trades and goods, that's capitalism, right? Which is the number one fallacy in society. It's the number one fallacy that people have about socialism and communism in general, right? Commerce has existed far before capitalism, right? It existed far beyond the development of that economic system. What is capitalism? Capitalism is the existence of private property, the existence of a bourgeois class that kind of owns society, big businesses, or even smaller businesses. That's the petty bourgeois. And there's a workers class that has to sell their labor power in order to get a wage to live, right? But they don't own anything, right? They don't own capital. So that's what capitalists, right? But a small business owner that owns their own business is a petty bourgeois. They're kind of a smaller level of capital ownership, as opposed to a bigger level of capital ownership, right? Those big multinational companies, right? That developed historically from the previous economic system, which is feudalism. And what was feudalism? Feudalism was what you saw in Game of Thrones, which is I'm the king, I'm the queen. By divine right, I own you for the rest of your life, and I'll own your children's, and I'll own your children's children. You got to work this land as a serf and a peasant, and I own you, right? But at some point, feudalism gave way towards capitalism, which was the destruction of aristocratic relationships, right? The fact that I was by birthright, I own you, right? It developed into, well, we can all master our own destiny, right? And that is how you got capitalism, right? You had the revolutions of the French Revolution, you had the revolutions of that period, which eliminated the aristocratic, the feudal relations, but it established the basis for a different economic system, which was capitalism, which is the production of goods and services, right? How to marshal those forces together, and then how you could then produce things at a far greater scale, right? And that's how you got feudalism from capitalism, right? So you no longer had the ability to be locked to a piece of land. You could then sell your labor. You could leave that plot of land and then sell your labor to another company. You're not tied to a lord, you're not tied to a king, right? In that particular time period, that was a progressive step forward in society, until it wasn't, until capitalism then became incredibly repressive, where instead of being able to leave your plot of land, you became what was known as a wage slave. That if you don't sell your labor power, then you will starve, right? Then you won't have a roof over your head, right? So it becomes its opposite, right? So that's what we say through these historical periods of time where socialism and then later communism, which is a stateless, classless society, is the next evolution in human society, right? The next elevation of relationships on a societal scale. And throughout all of those different periods of society, and before feudalism, by the way, was hunter-gatherers, like more primitive, early communal societies, right? They had the development of money. Because what is the development of money, right? Did money just come out of nowhere? No, right? We understand money as it was a development specifically tied towards of a need, the need of exchange, right? So before money existed, there was bartering, right? You know, I will trade you one squirrel pelt for, you know, one loaf of bread or something, right? Something, and for a long time that was the exchange, right? But at a certain level, that becomes inefficient, right? Because you can't. It's inefficient to say I'm going to get, you know, 10 or 20 pelts to trade equally for something. Over time, the transaction that needs to happen on a societal scale, you need a more standardized mode of exchange. And that's where money came from, right? Money came from was saying, we all agree that this monetary item, this currency, can be exchanged of equal value for something, right? I don't need to actually hunt or gather X amount of potatoes to exchange at all times. I know that this is a standard modicum of exchange. That served a need at that time, and which still does serve a need, that standardized exchange form. But then it becomes opposite, right? It becomes something that can command you, that it can enslave you through the dependency upon who controls the flow of money, right? Inflation, right? You know, the value of money decreases, right? While the standard of, or the cost of living goes up, right? But the diminishing value of what you're getting paid from diminishes. That's what Marxists talk about, the surplus value of labor, meaning Marx figured out that you actually produce far more in value for your boss, but you don't get paid nearly enough of that. You actually give more and more and more in terms of the value produced for them, but you get paid and recompensed less and less and less because the rising standards of living keep going up and up and up, right? So it's understanding these historical factors, these forces in society, right? So that's why when people say, oh, you bought something? Oh, you're not a communist, you're a capitalist, right? You exchange in the goods and services, right? Well, first off, you know, I live under capitalism. We haven't changed the social orders yet. So of course we have to survive, right? But it also misunderstands these social relations that have existed prior to the unique instance of private property ownership, or the ownership of private property and private capital, which is capitalism, right? The idea of socialism is predicated on the idea of superabundance, right? We can produce so much in society. We can meet everyone's needs. That's what I was saying earlier in the program. The Earth right now has the ability to feed 10 billion people. There are not 10 billion people on Earth. But why there's still millions and millions of people starving is because that food doesn't get distributed to the people that need it, right? Because of private ownership. It's not profitable to just give away food when that's the answer, right? So the idea of socialism and later communism is that you can produce so much to meet people's needs that people no longer need to scrap anymore. The dog eat dog mentality comes from scarcity. or rather imposed scarcity, right? Things become a lot more antagonistic when there's not enough to go around. That's why you have the police and the military. They exist to protect scarcity, right? There's only so much to go around. You need to stay in line. We have the guns, we have the tanks. You need to stay in line, right? That's what Marx's view of the nature of the state is. The state represents the interests of the ruling class, right? That's what the police exist for. They don't exist to serve and protect the common interest. They serve and protect capitalist interests, right? They're the ones that come in and evict you if you don't pay rent, right? They're the ones that come and break up strikes if you don't go back to work, right? That's the real face of the state, right? But that's why everything around it is designed to confuse you, to say, we actually have a choice when you vote for people, right? But in reality, you're just changing figureheads, right? And that's what bourgeois democracy really is. So that's what we talk about when we talk about analyzing things as they are, is that we actually have the means to produce so much in society where once we can meet people's needs, right? There's no need to scrape anymore. There's no need to be dog eat dog, right? When everyone can be fed, housed, clothed, right? There's no need for those antagonisms to oppress each other, right? On national lines, on racial lines, all those types of things, all those tools are used to divide the workers, to get them to kill each other instead of the real enemy, which is the ruling class, the ones that control everything, right? So to answer the critics, right? The critics is basically saying, oh, well, you participate in social relations that have always existed, therefore you're a hypocrite. And I think the answer is you have to understand, the true history of things, not what's being taught to you, because what's being taught to you is what's being taught to serve the interests, to make you think there's no alternative. This is as good as it gets. There's no way out of it. And I think a lot of people deep down know that that's not true. And that's why they look to Star Trek to say, hey, why can't we have that future? Seems a lot better than what we have right now. So I think that's where I think by Marxism and Star Trek really, they really mesh really well.
Everybody who watches it understands to some degree that it's a show that wants you to think about it and talk about it and kind of turn it over, like the moral conundrums of it. So it seems like a particularly good vehicle for this kind of conversation.
The best sci-fi, the best pop culture gets people thinking, gets people talking, right? So it may not be perfect, but it has a vessel. It's a vessel, literally, like the Starship Enterprise, to talk about certain things. And can you imagine in society how much better our pop culture, how much better our entertainment would be if we actually had the ability to write truly the stories that we want to write? One last thing I'll say is that one of the greatest losses, one of the greatest tragedies under capitalism is that there's so much potential that's not tapped. Meaning, how many artists, how many writers, how many poets, how many actors, musicians don't actually get to be those things because they have to take a job to pay the bills. So they become insurance adjusters, they become paper pushers, they become whatever it is to pay the bills, right? But what if you actually had the ability just to say your material needs are met, so you could actually do all the things you want to do, learn another language, play an instrument, write that great novel, write a movie, in a way like Star Trek, where many of our heroes, what do they do on their free time? They learn dead languages, they learn poetry, they do Shakespeare, right? All those things that we don't have time to do in our society because we are just trying to put food on our table and we're exhausted at the end of the day, right? So that's what we talk about. That's what for me is optimistic, is we as a society have barely tapped our potential because we're literally living paycheck to paycheck, hand to mouth, when it doesn't have to be that way. What couldn't we do if we didn't have to be trapped by a paycheck, trapped by rent, trapped by a mortgage, all those types of things? We could literally explore the stars and go beyond Star Trek, go beyond what we imagined the future could be. And I think that's what is ultimately very optimistic about Marxism, socialism, and communism, is that a better world is possible. It's very, very possible. We just have to fight for it and understand what's really at play.
Yeah, reaching that fuller potential is about as Star Trek and as Roddenberry as you can get, right? The idea of humans becoming something bigger and greater in the future than what we are now. Well, I would like to ask you, if the people that are listening to this who might be curious about some of the stuff that we've brought up, beyond just following you on Twitter, because everyone should do that, what are some other ways that people can learn more about Marxism and some of these other ideas?
Sure. So my Twitter handle is @BoomerNiner, the Star Trek compass. But the most important thing you can do is actually talk to each other and organize about these ideas, right? So when people talk about these ideas, learn that they're not the only ones thinking these things, that there's tremendous power in that. When enough people have ideas, that's when it becomes material force. So you have to organize in real life. So I organize with the International Marxist Tendency, the IMT, which is an international organization which are trying to build connections of workers around the world, right? It goes back to workers, the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains, right? But so it has to be built in advance of all the struggles that we know are going to happen in society, right? So we're trying to build an organization that's similar to the early days of the Communist International under Lenin, is to build an organization of workers worldwide to understand this is a struggle worldwide. So go to Marxist.com. That's our world website. In the United States, it's socialistrevolution.org. That's the best way to get involved. And just talking about these ideas and realizing you're not alone is tremendously powerful. And it's actually exactly what the ruling class is afraid of. They want you to get off the streets. That's why this past summer they just wanted the protests over George Floyd to end. They want people off the streets. When people are in the streets, they understand their own power, because they take that power and put it towards the thing that they have the most power in, and that's their workplaces. Can you imagine all those millions of people that we saw in the streets protesting police brutality? What if they use the energy to then stop production in their workplaces, have a general strike to really shut the economy down, not just in one country, but worldwide? That's the true power that the working class has, but we have a lot of work to get to that point. A lot of it has to do with education. So being organized, talking to each other is the first step. So Marxist.com and socialrevolution.org.
Well, thank you very much. And the last thing I want to ask you, of all the stuff coming down the pike with the new Star Trek shows, we have Strange New Worlds, Season 4 of Discovery, Season 2 of Picard, this new animated show, Star Trek Prodigy. Just as a fun little question to end things on, what are you most looking forward to?
It's one of those questions where it's a good problem to have. So I'm looking forward to Lower Decks Season 2. I think that was Lower Decks was a tremendous surprise. It was a show that I think surprised many people on such a fundamental level of just how good. I never thought that an animated show from one of the co-writers and co-producers, Rick and Morty, could produce such good Star Trek. And I think so. I'm very excited to see what they do in Season 2. What's going to happen with Boimler and the Titan and Freeman and Mariner. I'm excited for Picard Season 2. Picard is now a golem. He is synthetic. That is wild, right? What's going to happen with 7 of 9? I want to learn more about the Fenris Rangers. That's a very interesting concept. Discovery Season 4 now. Wild. What are they going to do in the 32nd? They got to rebuild the Federation. It is really interesting. It's really fun. And then, of course, I think Prodigy. I always loved Kate Mulgrew. Her voice is so unique and commanding. She has a good presence. So I think it's a perfect venue to kind of get newer generations to kind of watch Star Trek. The Prodigy's going to be very exciting to watch. I think Strange New Worlds too. That was another big surprise. Is how well a Pike reboot or kind of a reinterpretation would be taken. Who would have thought that Discovery Season 2 would provide a launching point for something like that? But that's, I think, just gonna be a fabulous. You'll get your kind of Planet of the Week, Alien of the Week episodes there, and I think Anson Mount and Ethan Peck and Rebecca Maynard, they struck gold there. It was like lightning striking. So I think you really want to go there. So the answer I just gave you was kind of a cop-out. I just said all the shows basically. But if I had to choose one, you pick
one of them first.
It was Lower Decks. I'm wearing the uniform, and I like that. But I think it's just they can do anything. I mean, it's wild. We can really see a real opening of the universe in a way that who would have thought that this cartoon could do that? But that's what being a fan is all about, being surprised, right? You want to be surprised. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us and having this discussion with us. I do appreciate you taking the time to be our guest. And I just want to let all of our audience know that next week we will be premiering some content with another guest. So that'll be available Friday at 7 p.m. Central Time. And until then, as always, live long and prosper, y'all.
Listen to the Tex-Trek podcast through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or at tex-trek.com. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/tex-trek, and follow Fatheree on Twitter at TXTrek. Please support us by liking our videos and subscribing to our channel on YouTube. Thank you and take care.